I call Jan Logie. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This budget delivered a small fiscal surplus. But today I would like to share some stories with this House from the community on the human cost of this government's decision to prioritise tax cuts for the wealthy. This government has offered crumbs to some of the poor and told newborn babies of beneficiaries they're not even allowed up to the table, let alone a fair share of the pie. Disabled people are amongst the poorest people in New Zealand. And last year, government changed the law to deny equal human rights to family members caring for them, compounding their family poverty. And this year, within the income support budget, we've seen further cuts specifically targeting people with disabilities. In 2012, the government slashed the disability allowance by $37 million, 9.2%, by removing funding for some medicines, alternative treatments, cutting funded services for beneficiaries, and reducing numbers getting the allowance. Last year, we saw this disability assistance budget underspent by $2 million, and now they're cutting that budget line again by a bit more than $5 million, and this is despite rising costs. It costs more to achieve a normal standard of living if you have a disability. In fact, the research shows that it can cost over $2,500 a week more just to have a normal standard of living if you have a significant disability. There are obviously other funding sources for people, but not for everyone. And there are widely acknowledged gaps between health, ACC, and work and income. Many people that I have spoken to with disabilities say they've lost considerable amounts of money per week from their benefits over the last couple of years. And there's a general consensus that what they receive from work and income does not cover anything like the real costs of living with a disability. To get the disability allowance, you need to provide receipts, but if you can't afford to cover the item in the first place, you can't claim for them. And further, some things have now been deemed standard costs and not disability costs, so won't be paid for. And disabled people are now having to regularly visit their doctor to verify their disability, which they then have to pay for, and whose doctor's diagnosis is not uncommonly overridden by work and income staff employed experts who may have no expertise at all in that health area. I've heard from some people, I've heard from one person who told me about getting a urinary tract infection because he's only supplied 4 leg bags per annum when the recommended minimum is 8. And people I've heard from who have developed infections and pneumonia because they don't have internal temperature regulation and they can't afford to heat their homes properly. I've heard from people with disabilities who are significantly underweight because they can only afford 1 meal a day. I've been told by a health practitioner who had a patient with mental health problems who was so stressed by the work and income system that it induced a psychotic episode that put them into hospital. I've been told by more than one person that they've been told against the policy that they can only claim up to 2 incontinence pads a day. Where is the dignity? And it's clear from the stories that I'm hearing that while problems are not universal, they are common enough to be sure that real harm is occurring. These are stories of some Dickensian nightmare. And the government is reducing budgets in the face of hardship. And while some work and income staff are doing their best, the reduced funding, lack of expertise, an entire goal to reduce the government's welfare liability instead of supporting people in need means people are suffering severe indignities. The government's line in response to these challenges is usually, well, the Greens would just leave people to rot on the benefit. This is not true. We would ensure that people can live in dignity, and we would implement a proactive EEO policy and agenda to remove barriers to employment. We believe most New Zealanders would be happy to pay for that.
I understand the next call is a split call. The Honourable Maurice Williamson, 5
Mr.
minutes.